In 1923, the SS Iron Mariner, a cargo freighter with a 22-man crew, vanished in the frigid North Atlantic. For 80 years, the world believed a story of mutiny and greed. In 2003, a deep-sea submersible exploring a new fiber-optic cable route would stumble upon the wreck, revealing a truth far more monstrous than the official lie. A secret the ocean had kept locked in its silent, crushing depths. Where are you reading us from? Share your city and country in the comments before we continue this story. The city of Port Sterling was a testament to one man's will. Carved from the unforgiving coastline, its very existence was owed to Croft Maritime and its founder, Silas Croft. The port was the city's heart, and the Croft shipping empire was the blood that pumped through it. Every family, every business, and every future was inextricably linked to the fortunes of the company, a reality that fostered both deep loyalty and a quiet, unspoken fear. Silas Croft was more than an industrialist. He was an architect of society. He built the town's library, funded its hospital, and was celebrated as a philanthropist of immense generosity. His public persona was one of paternal benevolence, a titan of commerce who cared for his workers as if they were his own family. In Port Sterling, his word was not just law, it was gospel, and his reputation was as unassailable as the granite cliffs that guarded the harbor. The SS Iron Mariner was the jewel of the Croft fleet, a modern freighter with a steel hull built to conquer the tempestuous North Atlantic. It symbolized the company's power and reliability. To the people of Port Sterling, its silhouette departing the harbor was a familiar and reassuring sight. It represented steady work, a connection to the wider world, and the promise of progress that Silas Croft had sold them all so effectively. At its helm was Captain Alistair Thorne, a veteran mariner of unwavering integrity. Thorne was a man of the sea, respected for his fair command and his impeccable safety record. He had spent a lifetime on Croft vessels, his loyalty to the company matched only by his devotion to the men under his charge. His reputation was spotless, a fact that would soon be deliberately and systematically destroyed by the very man he served. Thorne's crew was a reflection of Port Sterling itself, a loyal, experienced brotherhood of mariners. They were fathers, sons, and husbands who had grown up in the shadow of the port, their lives dictated by the tides and the sailing schedules of Croft Maritime. These were not conspirators or thieves. They were hard-working men, their hands calloused from years of labor, their trust placed entirely in their captain and their employer. The day of its final departure was unremarkable, shrouded in the typical gray mist of the North Atlantic coast. On the docks, routine farewells were exchanged with the quiet confidence of a swift return. Wives and children watched the ship steam out of the harbor, its horn a deep, resonant promise that it would be back in a few weeks. There was no sense of foreboding, no premonition that this was the last time they would see their loved ones. The ship's manifest was as mundane as the weather. Its cargo was officially listed as industrial machinery components, a routine shipment destined for the burgeoning factories of post-war Europe. The crates were sealed, their contents of little interest to the crew responsible for their transport. It was just another job, another line item in the vast ledger of Croft Maritime's commercial dominance, a detail too ordinary to warrant a second thought. As the SS Iron Mariner pushed further into the open ocean, it became a solitary speck against a vast canvas of churning gray water and an indifferent sky. The coastline of home faded from view, replaced by the endless, rolling expanse of the Atlantic. The ship and its 22 souls were now utterly alone, a self-contained world of steel and steam, navigating the immense and unforgiving wilderness of the sea. The last communication received was a standard radio transmission reporting calm seas and stable weather conditions. Captain Thorne's voice was professional and composed, giving no indication of any trouble aboard his vessel. The message was logged, filed, and forgotten. It was the last time anyone would ever hear from the SS Iron Mariner. The silence that followed was absolute, a void that would soon be filled with speculation and lies. Days turned into a week. The ship failed to make its scheduled port of call in Europe. At the Croft Maritime Headquarters in Port Sterling, a low hum of concern began to escalate into palpable anxiety. On the quiet residential streets where the crew's families lived, a collective dread took hold. Every passing hour of silence deepened the growing certainty that something had gone terribly wrong out in the vast, empty ocean. Silas Croft, with a face etched in solemn worry, personally announced the launch of an extensive search and rescue operation. He was a commanding presence, reassuring the panicked community that no expense would be spared to find his ship and his men. He played the part of the devastated patriarch perfectly, his public grief a masterful performance that masked a cold and calculated strategy already in motion to control the inevitable narrative. The search was vast, but ultimately futile. The unforgiving waters of the North Atlantic offered no clues. No floating wreckage, no oil slicks, no lifeboats, and no bodies were ever recovered. It was as if the ship, with its entire crew and valuable cargo, had simply sailed off the edge of the earth. The ocean had swallowed the Iron Mariner whole, leaving behind nothing but a chilling and impenetrable mystery for those left behind. In the absence of evidence, Silas Croft convened a formal inquiry. He skillfully steered the proceedings away from the possibility of a catastrophic accident or structural failure, which could have implicated his company. Instead, he began to meticulously construct an alternative theory, one that shifted the blame from his vessel to the very men who had served aboard it. He was not seeking the truth, he was manufacturing it. Croft produced carefully forged documents and paid witnesses who testified to Captain Alistair Thorne's supposed financial desperation. He painted a damning portrait of a once honorable man driven to an act of extreme criminality by personal ruin. It was a shocking and baseless accusation, but with Thorne and his entire crew unable to defend themselves, the lie began to take root in the fertile ground of public fear and confusion. The motive, Croft argued, was simple greed. The industrial machinery in the ship's hold was incredibly valuable, enough to set up 22 men for life if they could successfully make it disappear. He proposed a meticulously planned mutiny, led by a desperate captain, where the crew scuttled their own ship and escaped with the cargo on lifeboats, destined for a new life under new identities. The story was as audacious as it was false. With no wreckage to analyze and no survivors to offer a counter-narrative, the official inquiry concluded by accepting Croft's version of events. The case of the SS Iron Mariner was officially closed. The cause of its disappearance was recorded for posterity not as a tragedy, but as a crime, a premeditated act of mutiny, conspiracy, and grand theft orchestrated by its own crew, led by Captain Alistair Thorne. The verdict fell like a death sentence on the 22 grieving families. Their loss was now compounded by an unbearable public shame. They were no longer the widows and orphans of heroes lost at sea, but the disgraced relatives of thieves and traitors. In the close-knit community of Port Sterling, their names became synonymous with dishonor, their grief tainted by the poison of Croft's expertly crafted lie. To question the official story in a city entirely dependent on Croft Maritime was professional and social suicide. The families of the Iron Mariner's crew became pariahs, whispered about on street corners and shunned in the marketplace. They lived in a state of suspended grief, unable to mourn their dead properly because the world had already condemned them. Their silence was bought with the threat of ruin. The children of the crew grew into adults under the suffocating shadow of their fathers' alleged sins. They carried a legacy not of proud maritime heritage, but of shame. The lie was a generational curse, a stain on their family names that they could neither escape nor wash away. It shaped their identities and their futures, a constant painful reminder of the injustice that had been inflicted upon them. As years bled into decades, the story of the mutiny became an immutable part of Port Sterling's folklore. It was a cautionary tale told to new sailors, a dark chapter in the city's history that served as a warning about greed and betrayal. The lie, repeated for so long, had hardened into fact, cemented in local history books, and memorialized by its own unchallenged authority. The truth, however, lay dormant and perfectly preserved. It rested in the crushing blackness of the abyssal plain, 2 miles beneath the waves that had been its tomb. There, shielded from the world and the passage of time, the SS Iron Mariner held its secrets, its steel hull a silent monument to the 22 men who had been so cruelly wronged by history. For 80 years, the lie held fast, a foundation of deceit upon which a city's history was built. It seemed as permanent as the ocean itself, a story that would never be challenged. But the sea is a patient keeper of secrets, and it was about to surrender the one that would rewrite everything. What they didn't know was that the key to unlocking the truth had been sealed in an oilskin pouch, waiting in the dark for a light that was still decades away. Who could have imagined that the answer did not lie in speculation, but was written down, a final desperate testimony from a man who knew he was about to die? The year is 2003. 80 years of silence have passed, a period long enough for a lie to calcify into historical fact. 2 miles below the surface of the North Atlantic, a remotely operated submersible named Odyssey glided through the crushing eternal night of the abyssal plain. Its mission was mundane, to survey the proposed route for a new transatlantic fiber optic cable. Its powerful lights cut a solitary cone through a world that had never known the sun, revealing a landscape of silt and strange, bioluminescent life. The work was slow, methodical, and utterly routine. Suddenly, the sonar operator reported an anomaly. It was a massive, unnatural shape rising from the seafloor, far too geometric to be a geological formation. The pilot of the Odyssey carefully maneuvered the ROV closer, its high-definition cameras peering through the murky darkness. A long, dark form began to resolve on the monitors in the control room above. It was a ship. The team held a collective breath as the submersible's lights washed over a rusted but clearly visible nameplate on the bow. SS Iron Mariner. The ghost had finally appeared. The wreck was astonishingly preserved, its steel hull sitting upright on the ocean floor as if it had gently settled there for a long sleep. The frigid temperatures and low oxygen levels of the deep had created a perfect, timeless tomb, shielding it from the decay that would have obliterated it in shallower waters. It was not scattered in pieces, as one would expect from a violent storm. Instead, it was whole, intact, a silent steel monument that immediately contradicted the official story of a scuttled vessel. It looked like a ship that had been deliberately sunk. The discovery sent shockwaves through the maritime history community. News outlets around the world ran headlines about the legendary mutiny ship being found after 8 decades. For most, it was a fascinating historical footnote, a relic from a bygone era. But in a quiet university office hundreds of miles away, the news landed like a seismic charge. Dr. Eris Thorne, a respected maritime historian, felt the world shift on its axis. The discovery was not just academic for her, it was the culmination of a lifelong, deeply personal crusade. Eris was the great-granddaughter of Captain Alistair Thorne. She had grown up under the long, dark shadow of his alleged crime, a family shame that had fueled her academic pursuits and her relentless drive to find the truth. She had spent her entire career poring over archives, challenging the flimsy evidence of the 1923 inquiry and writing papers that theorized an alternative explanation. The world had dismissed her as a biased descendant chasing a ghost. Now the ghost had returned, and it had brought evidence with it, demanding a new hearing. She immediately used her credentials to petition for access to the expedition's findings. The company that owned the submersible, aware of the immense historical significance, agreed to cooperate. Eris flew to the recovery vessel, her heart pounding with a mixture of vindication and profound dread. For 80 years her family had carried the weight of a lie. She was now closer than anyone had ever been to lifting that burden, but she was also terrified of what the wreck might ultimately confirm. The truth, she knew, could be a double-edged sword. The recovery operation was a masterpiece of deep-sea engineering. The Odyssey was dispatched on multiple dives, its delicate manipulator arms tasked with retrieving artifacts that could shed light on the ship's final moments. They explored the bridge, the engine room, and the crew quarters, each new image broadcast to the monitors in the ship above. Eris watched transfixed as the camera feed drifted through the submerged corridors of her great-grandfather's ship. It was a haunting journey into a past that had, until now, existed only in her imagination. It was during an exploration of the first mate's cabin that they found it. Tucked away inside a small metal footlocker was a dark, unassuming object, an oilskin pouch tightly sealed with wax. In the anoxic deep, the leather and wax had been miraculously preserved. The team knew instantly that whatever was inside had been deliberately protected from the elements. The pouch was carefully secured by the ROV's robotic arm and began its slow, 2-mile ascent to a world that had forgotten the story it contained. Back on the surface, in a makeshift conservation lab aboard the recovery ship, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Eris stood alongside the conservation team, her hands trembling slightly as they worked under sterile lights to gently open the wax seal. The oilskin was brittle but intact. With a surgical precision, a technician sliced it open. Inside, nestled in the now fragile wrapping, was a small leather-bound journal. Its pages were stained and delicate, but the ink, protected from the water, was still remarkably legible. It was the first mate's log. The early entries were exactly what Eris expected. They detailed weather patterns, coordinates, engine performance, and the general morale of the crew. The first mate's handwriting was neat and professional, painting a picture of a completely normal voyage. The ship was making good time, the crew was in high spirits, and the new vessel was performing flawlessly. There was not a single word of discontent, no hint of financial desperation, and absolutely no suggestion of a brewing mutiny among the men. The official narrative was already beginning to crumble. Then, about a week into the voyage, the tone of the entries shifted dramatically. The neat cursive script became a hurried, anxious scrawl. The first mate wrote of a secret late-night cargo inspection ordered by Captain Thorne himself, who had grown suspicious of the cargo's unusual weight distribution. The manifest had listed industrial machinery, but Alistair Thorne, with his decades of experience, knew something was fundamentally wrong with the shipment. He had decided to open one of the crates to verify its contents himself. What they found in the hold was not machinery. The crate was filled with rifles, ammunition, and military-grade explosives. A quick inspection of several other containers confirmed their discovery. The SS Iron Mariner was not a cargo freighter on this voyage. It was an illegal arms transport, a flagrant violation of the post-war treaties that governed international shipping. Silas Croft had lied to his captain and his crew, turning them all into unwitting smugglers and criminals. Captain Thorne, a man of rigid honor, was described as being incandescent with rage. The journal chronicled the captain's next, fateful decision. Believing his employer had been deceived by a third party, Thorne used the ship's powerful long-range radio to contact Silas Croft directly, bypassing all normal channels. He confronted his boss with the discovery, demanding an explanation for the deception and declaring his intent to divert to the nearest naval port to report the illegal cargo. He was giving Croft a chance to make it right, assuming the man he had served loyally for 30 years was a victim himself. The response from Silas Croft was not one of shock or gratitude. It was a cold, unambiguous threat. The first mate wrote that the captain had stumbled back from the radio room, his face pale, having been told in no uncertain terms to proceed with the original course or face dire consequences. Croft made it clear that the shipment was his, the deception was intentional, and that nothing would be allowed to interfere with its delivery. The honor of Croft Maritime was a facade, and Alistair Thorne had just peeled it back. The final entry in the journal was written in a frantic, barely legible hand, the pencil strokes dug deep into the paper. It was a disconnected series of terrified thoughts, scrawled in what must have been the ship's final moments. It read, Croft's threat, not an accident, secondary charge wired to the hull, he knew we'd find it, a fail-safe, God help us. The words were a death sentence written by a man who knew he was about to be executed, a final, desperate testimony from the bottom of the ocean. The implication was staggering, a truth more monstrous than any tale of mutiny. The Iron Mariner had been deliberately sunk. Silas Croft had planted a secondary explosive charge on the ship, a contingency plan to be detonated remotely if his illegal operation was ever discovered by his own crew. He had not just risked their lives, he had planned for their deaths from the very beginning. The 22 men aboard the ship had been sacrificed to protect a secret and a lie. For Eris Thorne, the journal was a revelation that both vindicated and horrified her. Her great-grandfather was not a thief. He was a hero who had tried to do the right thing. He and his crew were not mutineers. They were the victims of a cold-blooded mass murder, orchestrated by a man celebrated as a philanthropist and a titan of industry. The official history of Port Sterling, the foundation of the Croft Empire, was built upon the graves of 22 innocent men. The discovery of the journal fundamentally transformed the case. This was no longer a historical mystery about a disappearance. It was now an active investigation into a decades-old homicide. The carefully constructed narrative that had protected Silas Croft's legacy for 80 years had just been blown apart by a ghost's whisper, preserved in ink and sealed in a humble oilskin pouch. The truth had finally surfaced, gasping for air after an eternity in the dark. Aris knew this was only the beginning. The journal was an extraordinary piece of evidence, but it was the word of one dead man against the powerful, entrenched legacy of another. The Croft family, now a global corporation run by Silas's grandson, would not let their patriarch's name be destroyed without a vicious fight. They would call the journal a forgery, a desperate fantasy written by a crewman about to be caught in his own criminal conspiracy. She clutched the conservation report, the transcribed words of the final entry burning in her mind. The phrase secondary charge was the key. It suggested a level of premeditation that was almost unthinkable. This was not a crime of passion or a desperate act. It was a calculated execution, planned with meticulous, ruthless efficiency by a man who had built an empire and would kill to protect it. Eris now had a direction for her search. The world had accepted the story of a mutiny because it was the only story available. For 80 years there was no counter-narrative, no voice to speak for the dead. Now the first mate's journal was that voice. It was a direct accusation from the grave, a roadmap to a crime that had been perfectly concealed by the vast, silent ocean. Eris Thorne had found the what, and she had found the who. Now she had to find the proof that would make the world believe it. The Croft legacy was a fortress built over decades with money, influence, and a carefully polished public image. Attacking it would require more than just the journal. It would require irrefutable, corroborating evidence that could withstand the onslaught of a legal team designed to bury the truth for good. Aris understood that she was about to go to war against a legend, a family, and the history of an entire city. She looked out at the gray expanse of the Atlantic, the very body of water that had served as both a tomb and a vault. It had kept its secret well. The recovery of the journal felt like the ocean itself was finally offering up an apology, a chance to correct a terrible injustice. The weight of 80 years of silence now rested squarely on her shoulders, and she felt a renewed sense of purpose, a burning need to see this through to the end. The case of the SS Iron Mariner was officially reopened, reclassified from a maritime loss to a multiple homicide. Aris Thorne was no longer just a historian. She was the lead consultant in a murder investigation, and the primary witness was a man who had been dead for 80 years. The journal had provided the first shocking piece of the puzzle, a glimpse into the darkness that lay beneath the surface of a celebrated man's reputation. The find was monumental, a one-in-a-billion discovery that had rewritten a key chapter of maritime history. It had cleared the names of 22 men and unmasked a hero. It had given the descendants of the crew the answer they had been denied for generations, but it had also unearthed a conspiracy far deeper and more sinister than anyone could have imagined, one that had been protected for nearly a century by power and silence. The mission of the Odyssey was complete, its accidental discovery having dredged up a truth that powerful forces had gone to murderous lengths to keep buried. For Aris Thorne, her own mission had just begun. The journal was the inciting incident, the catalyst that had reignited a cold case and set her on a collision course with one of the most powerful families in the country. She was now the custodian of the crew's final testament. She read the last line of the first mate's entry one more time. God help us. It was a prayer that had gone unanswered for 80 years. Aris made a silent promise to the men of the Iron Mariner that their final words would not be in vain. She would not rest until the world knew the name of the man who had sent them to their watery graves and condemned their families to a lifetime of shame. The journal was a ghost story, a corporate conspiracy, and a murder mystery, all rolled into one. It provided a narrative, a motive, and an accusation. It was the heart of the case, the emotional core that would drive the search for justice forward. But Aris knew that a heart on its own was not enough to win a war. She needed to find the cold, hard, undeniable facts that would support its story. The path forward was fraught with obstacles. She would have to navigate legal battles, public relations campaigns designed to discredit her, and the deep-seated loyalty that the city of Port Sterling still held for its founding father. The Croft name was etched into the very stones of the city, and tearing it down would be seen as an attack on the city itself. She was not just fighting a family, she was fighting a myth. The discovery of the wreck and the journal had answered the 80-year-old question of what had happened to the SS Iron Mariner. It had closed one chapter of the mystery, only to open a far more terrifying one. The focus was no longer on a crew of supposed thieves, but on the celebrated industrialist who had framed them for his own monstrous crimes. The real investigation was just getting started. The reopening of the SS Iron Mariner case was not a quiet academic affair. It was an explosion. With the first mate's journal now logged as official evidence in a multiple homicide investigation, Dr. Aris Thorne transitioned from historian to the primary consultant for a multi-agency task force. The journal was their roadmap, a ghost testimony from the abyssal plain, but Aris knew it was not enough. A diary, no matter how compelling, could be dismissed as fiction. To convict a man like Silas Croft posthumously and dismantle his century-old legacy, she would need cold, irrefutable, scientific proof. The search for corroboration began not on the high seas, but in the dusty, forgotten archives of Port Sterling. The reaction from Croft Maritime was immediate and ferocious. The corporation, now a global logistics behemoth, deployed a legal and public relations army with one objective: to annihilate the new narrative before it could take root. They issued a formal statement decrying the investigation as a defamatory spectacle, fueled by the delusional fantasies of a biased academic. They painted Aris as a woman consumed by a generational grudge, willing to forge history to absolve her family's name. The battle would be fought not just in the evidence room, but in the court of public opinion, a domain where the Croft name had reigned supreme for 100 years. At the helm of this counter-offensive was Silas Croft III, the great-grandson of the man who had built the empire. He was everything his ancestor was not: polished, media-savvy, and exuding an aura of modern corporate responsibility. In a carefully orchestrated press conference from the gleaming Croft Tower, he held up a framed photograph of his great-grandfather, his voice a practiced blend of sorrow and indignation. He spoke of Silas Croft's philanthropy, his love for Port Sterling, and the absurdity of accusing a city's founding father of mass murder based on a soggy, unverified booklet found in a shipwreck. He was a formidable adversary, the living embodiment of the lie Aris was trying to expose. Aris ignored the public smear campaign, focusing instead on the most chilling phrase in the journal: secondary charge wired to the hull. How could such a thing be accomplished in 1923? She convened with a team of naval historians and retired military demolition experts. They explained that, while crude by modern standards, the technology was readily available. A simple barometric or time detonator linked to a sufficient quantity of dynamite and sealed in a waterproof casing could have been affixed to the ship's keel during its last dry docking. It was a brutally simple and terrifyingly plausible method for ensuring a ship would vanish without a trace, leaving no witnesses. The experts' theory provided a potential how, but it hinged on a critical opportunity: access. Silas Croft would have needed a secret, unlogged period of work on the Iron Mariner shortly before its final voyage. The official Croft Maritime Archives, which the company reluctantly provided under subpoena, showed nothing of the sort. The ship's maintenance logs were pristine, detailing routine preparations and inspections. According to the official record, the vessel was in perfect condition, a testament to the company's commitment to safety. The records were too clean, too perfect. They felt less like a history and more like an alibi. Or, if the official records were a dead end, what about the unofficial ones? Aris began a painstaking cross-reference of the Port Authority's ledgers from 1923 against Croft Maritime's internal documents. For weeks, she and a team of forensic accountants sifted through faded ink and brittle paper, searching for a single discrepancy. They were looking for a ghost employee, a phantom payment, any financial irregularity that hinted at off-the-books work. It was a search for a needle in a haystack the size of a city's entire economic history, a task designed to exhaust and demoralize any investigator. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: the city's utility archives. While examining water and electricity usage records for the Croft dry dock facility, an analyst flagged a massive, anomalous power spike. It occurred over a single 48-hour period a week before the Iron Mariner's departure, a surge of activity that inexplicably did not correspond to any official work orders in the Croft logs. The dry dock was supposed to have been empty and dark during that time. Instead, someone had been working there, under the cover of night, using enough power to run a small factory. This power surge was the first crack in the 80-year-old facade. It was a tangible piece of data that directly contradicted the pristine narrative presented by Silas Croft III and the company's immaculate records. The official story claimed inactivity, But the physics of electricity consumption told a different tale. What secret work was so important that it had to be done in the dead of night, erased from the ledgers and powered by a surge of stolen energy? The question hung in the air of the investigation room, charged with possibility. Armed with this new evidence, Aris petitioned the court for a more invasive warrant, this time for Silas Croft's personal financial records from that period. The Croft lawyers fought it tooth and nail, arguing it was an unwarranted fishing expedition into the private affairs of a deceased and respected citizen. But the judge, swayed by the utility records, agreed. The sealed archives of Silas Croft's private bank were opened, and within them they found a single cryptic payment, a massive cash withdrawal, made the day after the power surge with the simple notation, "Port contingency." The payment was untraceable by design. A ghost transaction meant to leave no trail. But the amount was significant, enough to pay a specialized team a fortune for their work and their silence. The pieces were beginning to align, a secret work period confirmed by power usage and a secret payment confirmed by a private bank record. Aris now had strong circumstantial evidence that an unsanctioned operation had taken place on the Iron Mariner's hull. But who were the men who had performed this dark task? The investigation pivoted back to the city itself. If a secret crew was hired, they had to come from somewhere. Aris and her team began building a profile of potential workers, men with demolition or mining experience, men who were not on the regular Croft payroll, men who were desperate enough to take a high-risk, high-reward job and keep their mouths shut. They cross-referenced census data from the 1920s with union records, looking for individuals who fit the profile and who, perhaps, came into a sudden, unexplained sum of money shortly after the ship's disappearance. This led them to a man named Finian O'Connell, a former miner with a reputation for handling explosives and an even greater reputation for keeping secrets. O'Connell had died in the 1950s, but his name appeared on a list of independent contractors who had done occasional work for the port. More tellingly, land registry records showed that 1 month after the Iron Mariner vanished, O'Connell, who had been renting a small room in a boarding house, purchased a large farm outright with cash. It was a life-altering amount of money for a man of his station. Finian O'Connell was long dead, but his family was not. The investigators located his grandson, an elderly man named Thomas O'Connell, living in a quiet retirement community. When they first approached him, he was guarded and suspicious, loyal to the local memory of Silas Croft as a benefactor. He remembered his grandfather as a quiet, stern man who never spoke of his work. The investigators asked him if Finian had ever mentioned a special job for Croft Maritime, a job that paid exceptionally well. Thomas initially denied it, his face a mask of practiced ignorance, but Aris saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a buried memory, a story he had been told not to repeat. She presented him with the evidence, the power surge, the secret payment from Croft's account, and the land deed for the farm his grandfather had bought with cash. She explained that this wasn't about punishing his family, it was about uncovering the truth for the 22 families who had been lied to for generations. She spoke of Captain Thorne, a good man whose name had been destroyed to cover up a crime. Thomas O'Connell's composure finally broke. He confessed that there was a family story, a secret his father had passed down to him on his deathbed. His grandfather, Finian, had been hired directly by Silas Croft for a confidential hull modification on the Iron Mariner. He was the foreman of a small, hand-picked crew. They were told the device they were attaching was a new type of emergency scuttling charge to be used only in the event of a hostile takeover by pirates, a plausible lie for the time. They were paid a fortune for their work and swore to absolute secrecy. The most crucial detail Thomas provided was this: his grandfather was haunted by the job for the rest of his life. Finian had suspected the device was something more sinister, especially after the ship vanished under such mysterious circumstances. He had kept one thing from that night, a memento or perhaps a piece of insurance. Tucked away in a dusty attic box filled with his grandfather's old belongings, Thomas found it, a single rolled-up blueprint. It was not a schematic for the ship itself, but for the emergency charge. Scrawled in the corner in Silas Croft's own distinctive handwriting were the words, "Barometric trigger, 2,000 fathoms, non-retrievable." This was the smoking gun. 2,000 fathoms was over 12,000 feet, far deeper than any continental shelf. A device set to detonate at that depth was not a scuttling charge designed to protect a ship from pirates in coastal waters. It was a deep ocean execution device, designed to trigger only when the ship had reached the abyssal plain, a place from which nothing was expected to return. The note was a clear, undeniable instruction for an assassination, penned by the hand of the man who had ordered it. The blueprint connected Silas Croft directly to the murder weapon. The Croft legal team immediately claimed the blueprint was a forgery, and the O'Connell family story was a fabrication, a desperate attempt at fame or fortune. But forensic analysis proved them wrong. The paper and ink were authenticated to the early 1920s. More damningly, a handwriting analysis confirmed the script belonged to Silas Croft, a perfect match to his signature on the city's founding charter. The lie was unraveling, torn apart by a single sheet of aged paper that a guilty man had kept hidden for 30 years. Now Aris had a complete chain of evidence for the how. A secret work period, a secret payment, a witness to the installation, and the architect's own blueprint for the bomb. But she still needed to irrefutably prove the why. The journal claimed Captain Thorne had confronted Croft via long-range radio about the illegal arms shipment. But how could she prove a radio transmission from 1923 had ever happened? It was one man's word from a waterlogged diary against the silence of 80 years. Aris theorized that even a specialized, directed radio transmission could have been intercepted. In the 1920s, the world was a web of listening posts. Governments, navies, and even commercial entities were constantly monitoring the airwaves, paranoid about military signals and commercial espionage. If Captain Thorne made that call, it was possible, however remote, that someone else was listening. The key was finding the right archive, the right needle in an even larger haystack. Her request to access classified military and government archives from that era was met with bureaucratic stonewalling. The records were considered sensitive, irrelevant, or simply lost to time. It was a frustrating, demoralizing process of filing requests and receiving rejections. The Croft Corporation's lobbyists were working overtime, pressuring government contacts to keep those doors sealed shut. They knew that if a record of that transmission existed, their entire defense would collapse. The investigation focused on a specific clue from the journal. The first mate had noted the exact frequency Captain Thorne was using, a number that seemed unusual to him. Aris took that frequency to a historian of radio technology. The expert identified it immediately. It wasn't a standard commercial or civilian frequency. It was a highly specialized, long-wave band used almost exclusively by transatlantic naval patrols for secure communications. It was a frequency Silas Croft, a major maritime operator, would have known how to use and monitor. Why would a civilian freighter be using a naval frequency? The only logical answer was that Captain Thorne was trying to ensure his message to Croft was private and direct, bypassing the company's normal radio operators. It was a desperate and ultimately fatal attempt to contain the crisis and appeal to the honor of a man who had none. This technical detail added a powerful layer of credibility to the journal's account. It was a detail a forger would be unlikely to invent. The identification of the naval frequency was the key that unlocked the archives. With a specific verifiable frequency to search for, Aris was able to file a much more targeted request under national historical interest laws. The request was no longer a vague fishing expedition. It was a precise search for a specific signal on a specific date. After a protracted legal battle, a judge granted her team limited access to the declassified records of a naval listening station that had been operating off the coast of Newfoundland in 1923. For weeks, researchers scanned through microfiche reels containing thousands of pages of handwritten logs. Most of it was indecipherable static, atmospheric noise, and routine naval traffic. The sheer volume of data was overwhelming, and the hope of finding a single, faint transmission from a doomed cargo ship began to fade. It seemed the ocean and the airwaves had both conspired to keep the Iron Mariner's final secret buried forever. Then a junior researcher found it. It was a log entry from an operator on the night watch, dated the evening before the Iron Mariner was officially declared lost. The operator had noted a faint, distorted signal on the specified naval frequency. He described it as a highly agitated civilian voice, engaged in a heated, one-sided conversation. Believing it to be unauthorized use of the channel or perhaps atmospheric interference, he had transcribed as much as he could before the signal was abruptly cut off. Eris felt the world stand still as the transcribed text was placed in front of her. The words, logged by a bored naval operator 80 years ago, were a near verbatim match to the confrontation described in the first mate's journal. The transcript included Captain Thorne's horrified accusation, "Crates are full of rifles, not machinery, a violation of every treaty." It captured his declaration of intent. "I am diverting to St. John's to report this contraband." And it included his final pleading question before the transmission ended, "Silas, in God's name, what have you done?" This was the irrefutable proof, the trophy, that transformed the case. It was an objective third-party corroboration of the journal's central claim. The radio log was the ghost's second witness, an electronic echo of a murder that had been preserved in a government vault for 8 decades. It was no longer Eris's word against the Croft legacy. It was the United States Navy's historical record against it. The carefully constructed wall of denial built by Silas Croft III and his lawyers had just been shattered. The public revelation of the blueprint and the radio log transcription created a firestorm. The media narrative shifted overnight. Silas Croft III, once the poised defender of his family's honor, was now portrayed as the guardian of a monstrous lie. The story of the heroic Captain Thorne and his murdered crew captured the world's imagination. The 22 families, once shunned as relatives of traitors, were now seen as the victims of a century-long injustice, their quiet suffering finally brought into the light. In Port Sterling, the reaction was one of shock and collective shame. The city had been built on a foundation of philanthropy and commerce, but it was now forced to confront the reality that its very bedrock was a mass grave. The statues of Silas Croft that dotted the city squares were no longer symbols of civic pride, but monuments to a murderer. The name that had once been synonymous with progress and prosperity was now a stain on the city's history. The psychological toll on the community was immense. Faced with undeniable evidence, the Croft Maritime Board of Directors began to fracture. The pressure from shareholders and the public was unbearable. The company's stock plummeted as its reputation was irrevocably destroyed. Silas Croft III was forced to resign in disgrace, his attempts to defend the indefensible having made him a pariah. The empire built on a secret was now collapsing under the weight of its exposure. The legal ramifications were complex. With the perpetrator long dead, there could be no criminal trial. However, the descendants of the 22 crew members, now united as a single entity, filed a massive civil lawsuit against Croft Maritime. They sought not just financial restitution for 80 years of economic hardship and defamation, but a formal, public admission of the truth. They wanted the history books rewritten and their family names officially and permanently cleared. The investigation had successfully reconstructed the timeline of the crime with astonishing clarity. Silas Croft, engaged in a highly illegal and profitable arms smuggling operation, had used his own flagship vessel for transport. He had lied to his most trusted captain and crew. As a fail-safe in case his loyal captain proved to be too honorable, he had a remotely triggered bomb planted on the hull. When Captain Thorne discovered the contraband and threatened to expose him, Croft made a cold, calculated decision. From his office in Port Sterling, he had sent a signal. Miles out in the cold Atlantic, that signal triggered the detonator. The secondary charge had ripped a hole in the Iron Mariner's hull, sinking it not in minutes, but in seconds. It was a swift, brutal, and complete execution, designed to ensure there were no survivors and no wreckage. He then masterfully orchestrated the subsequent inquiry, framing his victims to cover his tracks and cementing his own reputation as a benevolent patriarch grieving a tragic loss. The sheer cold-bloodedness of the plan was what shocked the public most. This was not a crime of passion or a mistake. It was a premeditated act of mass murder, conceived as a business contingency. Silas Croft had weighed the lives of 22 loyal men against his own profit and reputation, and had found them wanting. The philanthropist who built libraries and hospitals had a secret ledger, one balanced with the blood of those who trusted him. Eris Thorne, having spent her entire life in the shadow of this lie, felt a profound sense of resolution, but not triumph. She had unearthed a truth far uglier than she could have ever imagined. She had cleared her great-grandfather's name, but in doing so had exposed a depth of human depravity that was deeply unsettling. She had won the war, but the cost of the original crime was a weight that could never be lifted, only acknowledged. The investigation had pieced together the fragments of a forgotten crime, using modern technology to give voice to the dead. Forensic accounting, digital archival retrieval, chemical analysis of 80-year-old ink, and a deep understanding of historical technology had all played their part. It was a testament to the power of methodical, relentless inquiry. The truth, Eris realized, does not expire. It simply waits to be found. The focus now shifted from investigation to resolution. How does a city, a corporation, and a group of families reckon with a crime of this magnitude after so much time has passed? The legal battles would continue, but the central mystery was solved. The question was no longer what happened, but what happens now. The answer would define the future of Port Sterling and the final legacy of the men of the SS Iron Mariner. The reconstruction of the truth had been a brutal process, an excavation of a buried wound. It had forced a community to confront the darkness at the heart of its own origin story. The myth of Silas Croft, the benevolent founder, was dead. In its place was the horrifying reality of Silas Croft, the ruthless killer. The city he had built now had to learn to live with the ghost of his crimes. For Eris, the journey was nearing its end. She had followed the whispers from her great-grandfather's grave, chasing them through archives and across oceans, until they became a roar that could no longer be ignored. She had taken on a legend and won, armed with nothing but the truth and an unyielding refusal to let a lie stand. The final chapter of the story, however, would be written not by her, but by the families of the crew. The blueprint and the naval radio log were devastating blows to the Croft legacy, yet the corporation's legal machine churned on, sowing doubt. They argued the blueprint was a discarded draft for a different project, and the radio log was a misinterpretation of a garbled signal. In the court of public opinion, a sliver of ambiguity was all they needed to protect the Croft fortune. Doctor, Eris Thorne knew she needed something more, a piece of evidence so personal and undeniable it would incinerate all doubt. She needed to find the voice of Silas Croft himself, an echo from the past that would confess in his own words. Her new hypothesis was born from a deep dive into the psychology of the man she was hunting. Silas Croft was not just a criminal. He was a narcissist of the highest order, a man who documented his triumphs and meticulously controlled every aspect of his empire. Eris theorized that if Captain Thorne had made a call that threatened his entire world, Croft would not have simply listened. He would have recorded it. It was an act of supreme arrogance, a desire to preserve the moment he vanquished a threat to his power, a trophy of his own ruthlessness. Securing a warrant to search the Croft ancestral manor, a building that had been turned into a private family museum, was a monumental legal battle. The Croft attorneys painted it as a desecration, a final, desperate harassment by a woman obsessed. But the weight of the existing evidence was too great. A judge reluctantly signed the order, granting Eris and a team of forensic archivists 24 hours to search one room, Silas Croft's personal study, which had been perfectly preserved since his death in 1958, a time capsule of power and secrets. The study was an imposing chamber of dark wood, leather-bound books, and the lingering scent of cigar smoke and ambition. It was a monument to a man's ego. The team worked with methodical precision, examining every book, every drawer, every inch of paneling. Hours passed with no results. The hope that had propelled Eris forward began to wane, replaced by the cold fear that Croft had been too clever, that he had left no final trace of his monstrous crime for the world to find. It was Eris who found it. Running her hand along the intricate carving on Croft's massive oak desk, she felt a tiny, almost imperceptible seam in the woodwork. It was a hidden release mechanism. With a soft click, a section of the desk's side panel slid open, revealing a small, felt-lined compartment. Inside, resting in a custom-made cradle, was not a document, but a single wax-coated phonograph cylinder. A small brass plate affixed to the cradle was engraved with a date and two words, Mariner Contingency. The artifact was incredibly fragile. Transported to a specialized audio restoration lab, the cylinder was handled with the reverence of an unexploded bomb. Experts used laser scanning technology to read the grooves without a needle ever touching the delicate wax surface, digitally reconstructing the sounds that had been trapped in silence for 80 years. As the first crackles of static gave way to a voice from the recording, the entire lab team fell silent. They were listening to a ghost, and he was about to confess to a mass murder. The confrontation was staged not in a courtroom, but in a televised public hearing demanded by the families of the crew. Silas Croft III sat at a polished table, flanked by his lawyers, his expression a mask of weary confidence. He was prepared to refute documents and debate interpretations. He was not prepared for what Eris Thorne produced next. She placed a digital audio player on the table. "Before you answer any more questions, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice steady and clear, "I believe you should hear a final statement from your great-grandfather." She pressed play. The voice that filled the silent room was unmistakable from old newsreels. Silas Croft, his tone not of panic but of chilling, reptilian calm. It was his side of the conversation with Captain Thorne. The recording began mid-argument. "Your honor is an unaffordable luxury, Alistair. You are a tool of this company, not its conscience. Your duty is to deliver the cargo, and you have failed." The words were a venomous rebuke to a man Croft had once called a friend. The audio captured the faint, tinny sound of Captain Thorne's voice bleeding through from Croft's receiver. The world heard Thorne's desperate plea. "Silas, in God's name, what have you done?" Then came Silas Croft's reply, a sentence that would echo through history and shatter a century-old lie. "What I have done, Captain," Croft's voice declared with icy finality, "is secure the future of this company, a future you are no longer a part of. The shipment will be considered lost at sea. So will you." The recording continued, revealing the true motive that had been buried even deeper than the wreck itself. Croft spoke of a secret, impending bankruptcy, a result of disastrous investments he had hidden from his own board. The illegal arms deal was not an act of simple greed, it was a desperate, all-or-nothing gamble to save his empire from complete collapse. The lives of 22 men were the collateral damage he had factored into his business plan, a necessary expense to ensure his own survival and legacy. A final damning click was heard on the recording, the sound of Croft depressing a switch on a device in his office. It was the remote signal, the electronic impulse that traveled miles across the ocean to the detonator on the Iron Mariner's hull. It was the sound of the trigger being pulled on 22 men. The recording ended. The silence that followed was absolute, a crushing weight of horror and understanding. The truth was no longer a theory. It was an audible, undeniable fact. Silas Croft III stared at the audio player as if it were a serpent. The color had drained from his face. His carefully constructed defenses, his family's honor, his entire identity, all of it had been annihilated in the space of 90 seconds by the voice of the very man he had spent a lifetime defending. There were no more arguments to be made, no more doubts to be sown. His great-grandfather had confessed from the grave, and his confession was an execution order. For the descendants of the crew sitting in the gallery, the moment was a confluence of agony and vindication. They were hearing the final moments of their loved ones' lives, the cold, calculating words of the man who had murdered them and then systematically destroyed their names. Tears streamed down their faces, tears of grief for the fathers and grandfathers they never knew, and tears of profound relief that the world was finally hearing the truth they had always felt in their bones. The hearing ended in chaos. Silas Croft III was escorted from the room, his face a vacant mask of shock, his empire in its death throes. The recording was a confession that transcended the statute of limitations. It was a moral conviction from which there was no appeal. Croft Maritime, the company built on this foundational crime, was now indefensible, its name synonymous not with industry, but with a monstrous, cold-blooded betrayal. Eris Thorne watched him go, feeling not a sense of triumph, but a deep, sorrowful quiet. She had done it. She had cleared her great-grandfather's name and brought justice to 22 families. But in doing so, she had unearthed a truth so dark it had permanently altered the history of a city and the legacy of a family. The ghost of the Iron Mariner had finally been heard, its silent scream from the bottom of the ocean amplified for the entire world to hear. The phonograph cylinder was the ultimate proof. It was the trophy of a killer, a memento of his own depravity, kept out of pure hubris. It was this arrogance, this belief that he was so far above consequence that he could preserve the very evidence of his crime that ultimately led to his undoing 80 years later. Silas Croft had written his own verdict and sealed it in wax, a final testament not to his power but to his eventual, inevitable failure. The revelation was now complete, the mystery solved beyond any shadow of a doubt. The what, the how, and the why of the SS Iron Mariner's disappearance were now part of the public record, etched into history by a madman's voice. The official narrative of mutiny was not just refuted, it was obliterated, replaced by a story of heroism in the face of corporate evil. Captain Alistair Thorne and his crew were not thieves, they were martyrs to one man's greed. The legal fallout was immediate. The civil suit against Croft Maritime was no longer a contest, but a surrender. The board of directors, facing global condemnation and a financial collapse, agreed to every demand made by the family's attorneys. The process of restitution, both financial and historical, could now begin. The focus shifted from the crime to the consequences, from the revelation of the truth to the act of making amends. The city of Port Sterling entered a period of profound and painful introspection. Every landmark bearing the Croft name, every plaque honoring his generosity, was now a reminder of the horrific secret upon which their prosperity was built. The community had to grapple with the fact that their founding father was a mass murderer. The process of removing his name from the city's institutions began, a symbolic act of excising a cancer from their collective identity. For Eris, the end of the investigation was the beginning of a new chapter. She had carried the weight of her family's shame her entire life, and now it was lifted. She had not only restored her great-grandfather's honor, but had also given a voice to the 21 other men who had died alongside him. Her lifelong academic pursuit had culminated in a moment of profound and lasting justice, a validation of her unwavering belief in the power of historical truth. The story of the Iron Mariner was no longer a cautionary tale about mutiny. It had become a testament to the endurance of truth, a story of how 22 men, silenced by a monstrous act of violence and buried beneath 80 years of lies, could finally have their story told. Their names, once symbols of disgrace, would now be etched in stone as heroes who chose integrity over obedience, even at the cost of their own lives. The truth had been a long time coming, traveling from the crushing darkness of the abyssal plain to the sterile quiet of an audio lab, and finally into the light of a public hearing. It had survived the depths of the ocean and the passage of nearly a century, proving that some secrets are too heavy for the sea to hold forever. The final chapter was not about the crime, but about the slow, painful, and necessary process of healing. The public condemnation of Silas Croft was swift and universal. His legacy was reevaluated overnight, his statues torn down by angry citizens, his name becoming a byword for corporate evil. He was a man who had built a city, but the foundation he used was made from the bones of innocent men. The world now saw him for what he was, a monster who had hidden in plain sight, cloaked in the guise of philanthropy and civic duty. Aris stood on the docks of Port Sterling, looking out at the gray Atlantic. She thought of her great-grandfather, a man she had only known through stories and the shadow of a lie. She had finally given him peace. The weight of 80 years had been lifted not just from her, but from the descendants of an entire crew. The silence of the Iron Mariner had finally been broken, and its story would now serve as a permanent warning. The recording was more than just evidence. It was a final judgment. It stripped away the myth of the great industrialist and revealed the hollow, sociopathic core of a man who saw human lives as entries on a balance sheet. The confrontation was not just with Silas Croft III, it was with the very idea that wealth and power could permanently bury the truth. It was a battle that Eris Thorne, armed with history, had decisively won. The emotional resolution for the families was complex and bittersweet. They had their answers, their vindication, and the restoration of their family names. But the truth of their ancestors' final moments, betrayed and executed by a man they trusted, was a horror that would now be a part of their family lore. Justice had been served, but the scars of the original crime and the decades of shame would take generations to fully heal. The world now understood the full scope of the conspiracy. Silas Croft had not acted alone in the cover-up. He had used his immense influence to bribe officials, coerce witnesses, and manufacture the evidence that condemned his own crew. The investigation had exposed a web of corruption that extended deep into the city's founding, forcing a complete re-examination of its history. The truth had not just toppled a statue, it had shaken the city to its foundations. In the end, the story was a simple one, stripped of all its complexity. It was about a good man, Captain Alistair Thorne, who refused to compromise his principles, and an evil man, Silas Croft, who was willing to kill to protect his secrets. For 80 years, the evil man's version of the story had prevailed, but the truth, once discovered, had a power and a momentum that no amount of money or influence could stop. Eris knew her work was done. She had followed the thread of a historical injustice from a dusty family legend to a preserved shipwreck, and from a waterlogged journal to a killer's own recorded confession. She had pieced together a puzzle that had been scattered across time and the ocean floor. The case was closed, the mystery solved, the lie exposed. What remained was the quiet, enduring task of remembrance.